I'm Larry Ray, President and CEO of American Manganese Inc., listed on the TSX Venture, ticker symbol AMY, A-M-Y, with proprietary patents in the U.S., China, and South Africa. Our focus is on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. China recently legislated the responsibility for recycling onto their electric vehicle manufacturers and importers. For more information, please visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is James Corbett, publisher of the CorbettReport.com and editorial writer for the International Forecaster. He's speaking to us from Japan. James, welcome back to the show.
Well, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Jim.
One of my favorite cars to drive was a Nissan. And apparently Nissan and Mitsubishi, who make some pretty hot sports cars, are in merger talks. Can you tell us anything about it?
Yes, this is something of a necessity that's happening at the moment because of the developing scandal where Mitsubishi Motors shares are in serious decline because of the scandal revolving around some manipulation of fuel economy tests that they've been doing that they have now admitted to. So basically, Mitsubishi Motors have been producing mini cars that they've been fudging the fuel efficiency numbers on for quite a while now. So going back to at least 1991, they're now admitting to this. There's a bit of a crisis going on. So now Mitsubishi Motors and Nissan are in talks for some sort of tie-up, not necessarily a merger per se, but it looks like Nissan is angling to get a bigger share of Mitsubishi Motors stocks. And this, as I say, Mitsubishi Motors has been producing some of these mini cars for Nissan, so it's really something of just trying to, I think, hide the corporate responsibility, or at least shunt it off to Mitsubishi and maintain Nissan's clean nose in all of this. However it plays out, I think it's interesting to note that Mitsubishi is a part of a system here in Japan of these gigantic corporations. And it's not exactly a single entity, but there are a number of loosely connected companies using the Mitsubishi name: Mitsubishi Corporation, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Mitsubishi UFJ, Mitsubishi Motors is in there. There's a couple of dozen such corporations that are all together make up a sort of gigantic part of the Japanese economy. And it's I think just an overall sign of the weakness of Japan's economy, because when you look at it, there are really just a handful of corporations, gigantic corporations like this, that control the vast share of the Japanese economy, and it's all out of proportion to any other developed nation. A recent study showed that 30% of Japan's top 300 companies have been created since the 1960s. That is to say, 70% of the top 300 companies were created over 50 years ago. And compare that to something like the United States, where only 20% of the top 300 companies were created over 50 years ago. It shows that there is a stagnation in the Japanese economy, and the fact that even these gigantic monolithic companies are starting to have to merge together in order to survive, I think shows a real decline in the competitive nature of the Japanese economy overall, and it's certainly not a good sign, I think, for Japan or its reputation as a reliable car manufacturer.
Well, when you're in virtual monopoly situations like that, your creativity takes a dive, doesn't it?
It certainly does, and I think that's been one of the major points of the Japanese economy for the last 20 years of this deflationary bubble burst that we've been living through. There hasn't been a lot of innovation going on from Japan, where, of course, in the 1980s, all of the high-tech buzz was about Japan and about Sony and the innovations that were coming out of there. There hasn't been anything like that in the last couple of decades, and I think they've really been replaced by this point. And unfortunately, that's also starting to sink into the car market now, the auto market. So even that share of the economy is starting to shrink, which is definitely not helping the Japanese economy overall. They just incidentally Japan generally posted its 21st straight month of current account surplus i.e. exporting more than they import. But that's really only because of the declining oil prices and cheap energy imports, which has given a sort of boost to that number. But it is not because of any kind of growth in exports from Japan generally, or any uptick in actual manufacturing here. Quite the opposite. And as oil prices start to rise again, I think we're going to see that current account surplus go back into the red.
How concerned is the average Japanese person about this?
I think it's just a general sense of foreboding. I mean, obviously, people who are directly involved with these companies and industries are on the front line, but I think everyone understands that there is just a kind of perpetual decline, and I think there has been a belt tightening that's been going on for a couple of decades here that doesn't seem like there's going to be any stop to it anytime soon, and it's really starting to cut into the living standard of a lot of people here, which has obviously declined since the bubble years, and as I say, continues to decline, so that people continue to work more and more hours and continue to scrape by with less and less savings to be able to sock away at the end of the month. And as I say, there doesn't seem to be anything on the horizon even that's going to really turn that around, as, again, so much of the Japanese economy is stagnated and is represented by these 50-plus-year-old corporations that themselves are really just holdovers from the old, really feudal system, or the imperial system, which took over from the feudal system. It's always been the same handful of companies that have been at the core of the economy, and because of that stagnation, there hasn't been a lot of innovation here for a very long time.
Now, Japanese society on the street anyway, it seems to be very safe and secure and public peace, but there's a lot of corruption behind the scenes that the average person wouldn't see, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, crime in Japan is organized crime. There's almost a tacit acceptance of the mafia being a part of Japanese society, in the sense that when there is crime, at least it's organized, and they generally tend to stick to sort of the code of honor of these mobs, that if you don't mess with them, they won't mess with you, and they don't like petty street crime kind of things. So it is a very safe country in that respect. You're very unlikely to get mugged on the street or anything in Japan. But having said that, yes, there is a lot of endemic corruption at the core of the Japanese economy, and that plays out in two ways. And we're seeing that playing out in the run-up to the 2020 Olympics, with all of the money sloshing around for infrastructure projects in the run-up to those games. A lot of that money is being directed either to construction companies, which tend to have ties back to the mob, and or construction companies that tend to have ties back to retired police officers who get these golden parachutes into these types of companies, and there's a lot of connections that come with that. So there's a lot of graft, kickback, and corruption that really is the grease that greases the engine of the Japanese economy.
I was just going to ask about, I heard, stories about retired cops and organized gangsters getting together to buy construction companies, specifically to take part in the Fukushima cleanup.
Yes, Fukushima cleanup has had Japanese mafia involvement, including such things as getting the mafia to round up homeless people that they then use as workers for the cleanup project. That's been exposed. Things like that have been going on, and I think that's really just a reflection of what's been going on here for a very long time. It's not specific to Fukushima or to the 2020 Olympics or anything in particular. It's just the way that the Japanese economy functions is through these types of organized corruption, and that's all it is. And there's very often this will be exposed, and it will cause a scandal, and some people will get arrested, some people will have to do apologies and drop out of politics. But every single administration that comes along, there's these types of scandals keeps popping up, because again, I think this is just the way the Japanese economy is structured, and unfortunately sometimes it results in things like construction companies here have been under fire for failing to live up to earthquake prevention codes, basically fudging their blueprints to make it look like they've taken certain precautions that they haven't, which becomes exposed during times of earthquakes, like what we're seeing in Kumamoto. So it can have very real consequences on the people living here. And although obviously the Japanese public isn't happy with it, again, it just seems to be woven into the way that this society has been structured.
Well, isn't it so suspicious if you have retired cops and crooks getting together? I mean,
yeah.
a long-term relationship that they're just consummating?
Yes, it's a famous part of the relationship here where police officers will have regular meetings with the heads of the organized crime groups, and the organized crime group will leave a list of their members in the garbage can and then walk out of the room for a few minutes and, if the policeman happens to see it and look through it. There's a nudge and a wink that they know of each other and they work with each other to a certain extent, and there's a complicated set of rules that they follow basically to ensure that the people at the tops of these organizations will be able to continue their power, and the organizations themselves will more or less know their limits as to what they can and cannot get away with. And it's a strange relationship, but it exists, and that's how crime is organized in the society.
We'll have more with James Corbett right after the break.
I'm Larry Ray, President and CEO of American Manganese Inc., listed on the TSX Venture, ticker symbol AMY, A-M-Y, with proprietary patents in the U.S., China, and South Africa. Our focus is on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. China recently legislated the responsibility for recycling onto their electric vehicle manufacturers and importers. For more information, please visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
Welcome back. We're speaking with James Corbett. Is China still rounding up the so-called usual suspects in connection with the collapse of their stock market?
Well, not just the usual suspects. In fact, just last week, there was a pretty big story about China's quote-unquote Warren Buffett, this Xu Zhang character, who is the head of CITIC Securities, the actual president of CITIC Securities. He was a high-ranking member of CITIC Securities and the head of Seji Investment, which was one of the firms that was able to post 20% growth in net asset value during that time of the stock market collapse last year, where the benchmark indicator dropped 35% in 3 weeks. So you had this Seji Investment taking off during that collapse. So, of course, that attracted the interest of Chinese regulators and authorities. They finally arrested this billionaire hedge fund manager, and it's interesting to see this playing out. Certainly, there has been a crackdown, generally speaking, on anyone that the Chinese authorities haven't liked or anyone they've suspected in engaging in shenanigans during this time. But for someone as prominent as Xu Zhang to fall is pretty interesting. It certainly indicates that there may be beyond just the actual charges involved here and whatever corruption that might have been going on in whatever trade Seji Investment was making, there may be a bit of infighting going on in the upper ranks of the Chinese oligarchy. CITIC is extremely important in the overall Chinese investment infrastructure. It is basically an arm of the Chinese government that has been extremely important in the last few decades, overseeing Chinese investments around the world and working closely with the Rockefellers and other oligarchs in other countries to create the Chinese dragon, as we've come to see it in the last couple of decades. So for someone as high-ranking as Xu Zhang to fall to this certainly shows there's some high-powered politics going on. To be fair, he's only been arrested and has not actually been convicted of anything yet, so we'll see how this plays out. But for him even to be arrested, I think, is a pretty major development.
What's the acquittal rate in China?
I would imagine very low. I don't know the actual number, but yes, it's once you get arrested for it, I mean, there's certainly the implication that the government wants you to go to jail at the very least.
And of course, who cares about the evidence? Obviously, you're guilty if you were arrested.
It's interesting to see how many of these people will get arrested and then will come out with these zombified confessions that are blared on national TV a few days later, confessing to everything and anything that the government wants them to confess to. So we'll see if that plays out with Xu. Maybe he has some high-ranking political strings that he can pull and maybe weasel his way out of it. But at this point, it looks like he's heading towards some sort of conviction.
Has there been anything more about the Chinese government executing specific people to meet the demand for donated organs?
I haven't seen a lot of coverage of that in the last few years. I have looked into it in the past. It certainly does go on, but I haven't seen a lot of that talk about that, at least during the Xi Jinping era. That's not to say it's not going on. I just don't. I haven't seen a lot of coverage of that story particularly.
In China, apparently somewhere, someone is producing very realistic looking counterfeit gold coins. They look like a genuine Canadian maple leaf gold coin or a U.S. eagle coin. They're made with lasers. And what it is, it's gold-plated tungsten. And, of course, tungsten, well, it is a valuable metal. It's not the same as gold. And apparently there's hundreds of thousands of them in circulation. Is that a common problem there? We know Hong Kong is kind of the knockoff counterfeit capital of the world. Would they be the kind of people behind something like that?
Well, we've definitely seen this several times in the past, from China specifically, and this tends to come up every so often. The last time we saw a huge surge in this, of course, was 2009, back when gold hit its top. So it's a sign, I think, of the demand for physical gold. Obviously, when there's a huge demand, then there will be people coming along to try to take advantage of that, and it seems to come out of China quite often. So there's a lot of different facets to this, but I think the underlying point of a story like this is caveat emptor, know your dealer, make sure that you trust and understand and have a relationship with your gold dealer, and you've worked with them in the past. Start off with small orders and work up to bigger orders. Don't necessarily trust online super savings types of offers. These are just the general types of practices people should follow if they want to avoid it. But these, as I say, these types of stories come up every few years, and certainly when gold is on an uptick, we see more stories like this.
You were talking about the Japanese economy slowing down and how the middle class there is shrinking. The U.S. middle class is not doing very well either.
It is not, and in fact, we have some hard numbers to put to that now, as Pew has just released some new research from the research center showing that there is, not only has now America turned to the point where the majority of the population is no longer in the middle class, but that of 229 metropolitan areas that were surveyed, 190 of them have now shown a median income drop, and a drop in the number of people in the middle class over the past 16 years, since 2000. So this is, I think, significant, because this plays out in a lot of different ways. I think this plays into the Sanders and Trump insurgencies in the Republican and Democratic parties that we're seeing this election cycle. And it plays out in a lot of different ways, a lot of growing discontentment around the United States. Now, on the back of that decline in the middle class, of course, that equates to a growing of both the lower class and the upper class. So in I believe it was 108 of those metropolitan areas that saw the shrinking middle class, it saw an increase in both upper class and lower class, i.e. people are being pushed to the polls as manufacturing goes offshore, and company executives get nice cushy bonuses for increasing profits for their companies, and basically factory workers are getting pushed out into lower paying minimum wage type service jobs. This is what the American economy is devolving into. And as I say, this has a lot of political consequences that we're just starting to, I think really just starting to see the thin edge of the wedge of what's going to become a rising tide of displaced people who are very unhappy. Another consequence of that is that we've seen a rise in the suicide rate of adult white males in the United States over the past couple of decades, that I think can be directly tied into this, as people who have expected a certain type of lifestyle have not been able to provide that for their families, and we're starting to see that playing out in very real terms in terms of a rising suicide rate among certain demographics. So this is playing out in a lot of different ways, and again, I don't see without some sort of major innovation or some turnaround in terms of manufacturing or something in those terms, I don't see a turnaround in this trend in the near future in the United States.
The states will become serfdoms. You have the nobility at the top and the peasants at the bottom.
It's neo-feudalism in a lot of different ways. And one, I think, really stark example of that is that one of the very few metropolitan areas that did actually show a rise in lifestyle and middle class people in living in their borders was Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. And there was an excellent expose that was just written by Kelly Vlahos. It was in the AmericanConservative.com, talking about how wartime Washington lives in luxury. And she goes through the opulent conditions that a lot of these people who are either directly employed by the government or contractors working for the defense industry that's making a killing, quite literally, over the war machine of the last decade and a half, are living exceptionally opulent lifestyles in Washington, D.C. these days, while, of course, the rest of the country is struggling to get by. And I think that's a perfect snapshot of what the economy of the United States is devolving into. It's kind of a security, military, industrial / terrorism complex that's arising out of the ashes of the old military-industrial complex, and that's really taking over the mainstream economy, so that you have these pockets of very, very opulent lifestyles in places like Washington that are politically connected. Meanwhile, Main Street in most of the rest of the country is wilting on the vine.
Well, you see the same thing in Canada. Ottawa is recession-proof. And the politicians, because they're being paid very well, they live in very nice homes and everything around them is very nice, they lose touch with the average person.
It's a fact of life, I think, everywhere in the world, that the political class becomes a type of crony class that looks after themselves and their interests. And there was some interesting reporting going on, again, about the United States Congress recently, talking about how congressmen actually spend their time. And it's average for congressmen to now spend as much as 30 hours per week in call centers, basically raising funds from donators for their political parties. This is how congressmen actually make their living, and I'm sure the Canadian Parliament is not immune to this type of new political reality. That's really more about lobbying and raising funds and making sure donators keep the money flowing than it is about actually running the country.
Well, you had Senator Mike Duffy was super popular with the Prime Minister until he fell out of grace over his expenses because he would raise so much money as a public speaker for the party.
This is the point. Again, it's a game of backslapping and back scratching, and as long as you're playing the game effectively, you will be a popular person for your political overlords. And of course, with the Senate being appointed by the Prime Minister, as long as you're in the good graces of whatever party the Prime Minister might be a member of, you're going to probably have a nice, cushy job.
Now, Duffy was acquitted of all 31 charges he faced, but the head of the Senate Financial Committee said, he probably still broke some House rules, and we never investigated him because he was under police investigation. So, he's not out of cold water yet.
Yes, but unfortunately, again, that doesn't necessarily bode well. I mean, just the fact that he can delay justice like that because other justice is supposedly working its way through the system. Again, we'll have to wait and see how it plays out and what is actually discovered. But I'm not exactly holding my breath. And again, I'm sure this is not exactly the only person in Ottawa who's using and abusing the system for their own purposes.
Yeah, flying your whole family across the country for a birthday party and claiming it was government business because you shook hands with a former compatriot from Parliament Hill.
Yeah,
exactly. That kind of stuff.
And, again, par for the course.
That's politics. James, thank you very much for chatting with us.
Always appreciate having me on. Thank you.
My guest has been James Corbett, publisher of the CorbettReport.com and editorial writer for the International Forecaster. He spoke to us from Japan. You're listening to HowStreet.com radio. Find us on Twitter at Talk Digital Net. Our popular YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. Comments or questions can be sent to info@HowStreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard. Thanks for listening.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com radio is a production of How Street Media Incorporated.